Richard Benjamin Speck was born in Kirkwood, Illinois in 1941 and was the seventh of 8 children. The family moved to Monmouth, Illinois shortly after the birth of Speck. In 1947, when Speck was 6 years old, his father died from a heart attack at the age of 53. Speck was reportedly very close to his father. In 1950, 3 years after the death of his father, Speck's mother married a man from Texas with a 25-year criminal record that ranged from forgery to several DUIs. The new husband was also a heavy drinker, unlike Speck's father. During the years of 1951 to 1966, Speck and his family moved frequently, living in 10 different addresses, usually in poor neighborhoods. Speck loathed his stepfather, who was often drunk, verbally abusive, and frequently absent. Speck struggled in school due to the fact that he was so self-conscious, he refused to wear the glasses he needed for reading, and subsequently failed every subject. He started drinking heavily at age 12, and by age 15 he was getting drunk almost every day. His first arrest, in 1955, at age 13 for trespassing, was followed by dozens of other arrests for misdemeanors over the next 8 years. In 1962, Speck married Shirley Annette Malone, and they had a daughter. In July 1963, at the age of 21, Speck was sentenced to serve 3 years in prison after being convicted of forgery and burglary. He was paroled in 1965 after serving 16 months at Texas State Penitentiary in Huntsville, Texas. His release lasted a week. On January 9, 1965, Speck was arrested again after attacking a woman in the parking lot of her apartment building. Speck was wielding a 17-inch carving knife, but fled the scene when the woman screamed. After he was caught, Speck returned to prison for what turned out only to be 6 months due to a clerical error. In 1966, Speck bought an older car and then robbed a grocery store on the very next evening. When Speck found out the police were looking for him, he decided to leave Dallas and avoided being arrested there for what would have been his 42nd arrest in Dallas. Speck's sister drove him to the bus depot where Speck took a bus to Chicago, Illinois. While Speck was in Illinois, he worked several odd jobs, and during his time there he threatened one man with a knife. He also burglarized and sexually assaulted a 65-year-old woman, Mrs. Virgil Harris. A week after that, he murdered a 32-year-old barmaid, Mary Catherine Pierce. On April 19, 1966, Speck realized law enforcement was onto him and moved back to Chicago. During his stay in Chicago, Speck worked several odd jobs, including a short term in the Merchant Marines before being kicked out due to his drinking problems. He left the Shipyard Inn's Tavern at 10:20 p.m. and began walking toward 2319 East 100th Street. At 11 p.m. on July 13, 1966, Speck broke into the 2319 East 100th Street townhouse in Chicago's Jeffrey Manor neighborhood. The townhouse was functioning as a dormitory for student nurses. He entered and, using only a knife, killed Suzanne Bridget Ferris, 21, Merlita Ornado Gorgulo, 23, Mary Ann Jordan, 20, Patricia Ann Matusik, 20, Valentina P. Passion, 24, Nina Jo Schmall, 24, and Pamela Lee Wilkening, 20. Speck held the women in a room for hours, leading them out one by one, stabbing or strangling each to death, then finally sexually assaulting and strangling his last victim, 22-year-old Gloria Davy. Intervals of between 20 and 30 minutes elapsed between each murder. One woman was able to escape death because she crawled and hid under a bed while Speck was out of the room. Fingerprints found at the scene were matched to Speck. 2 days after the murders, Speck attempted suicide, and he was taken to the Cook County Hospital on July 17th at 12:30 a.m. One of Speck's tattoos, "Born to Raise Hell," was recognized by a 25-year-old surgical resident physician, Dr. Leroy Smith, who had read about the story in a local newspaper. He called the police and Speck was finally arrested. On April 15, 1967, after 49 minutes of deliberation, The jury found Speck guilty of the murders and recommended the death penalty. On June 29, 1972, the U.S. Supreme Court declared the death penalty was unconstitutional. On November 21, 1972, Speck was back in court, and Judge Richard Fitzgerald resentenced Speck to from 400 to 1,200 years in prison, 8 consecutive sentences of 50 to 100 years. Shortly before December 5, 1991, Speck was transported from Stateville Correctional Center to Silver Cross Hospital in Joliet, Illinois, after complaining of severe chest pains. Speck later died in the early morning hours of December 5th, of what was believed to be a heart attack. In 1996, Chicago television news anchor Bill Curtis received videotapes made at Stateville Correctional Center in 1988 from an anonymous attorney. The videotape showed explicit scenes of sex, drug use, and money being passed around by prisoners, who seemingly had no fear of being caught. Speck was at the center of it all, performing oral sex on another inmate, while sharing large amounts of cocaine with other inmates, wearing a pair of women's underwear, and sporting female-like breasts, allegedly grown using smuggled hormone treatments, and boasting, "If they only knew how much fun I was having, they'd turn me loose." From behind the camera, a prisoner asked Speck if he had killed the nurses. Speck responded, "Sure I did." When asked why, Speck shrugged and jokingly said, "It just wasn't their night." Asked how he felt about himself in the years since, he said, "Like I always felt, had no feeling. If you're asking me if I felt sorry, no." He then described in detail the experience of strangling someone. "It's not like TV. It takes over 3 minutes, and you have to have a lot of strength."